morning, everybody, and welcome back to another Nitpicks Facebook Live. Hi, Lee.
Hi, Hannah.
It's nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
So every Thursday morning, we do a Facebook Live. So welcome back if you've seen us before. And if this is your first Facebook Live, we have a whole archive of past live streams on our Facebook page, on our website, in the Learning Center, and also on YouTube. So you can catch up with Lee and I through many weeks now of doing these. We've done some past episodes on like Yarn 101 and also Needle 101, so some educational things. We've done interviews, and this week, Lee, what are we talking about?
We're going to talk about patterns. My favorite thing. Yarn's my favorite thing too. It's all my favorite thing. Yeah, but so I designed the pattern books and individual patterns. I graphic design them here for Nitpicks. So we're going to be walking you through kind of the anatomy of a knitting pattern, what all the parts are, what they all mean, how to navigate them, and answering your questions. So please ask us questions and we can talk about specific things that you want to know more about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So today we are going to be talking about one of our free patterns, using it as an example, and that's the Prospects, Cowl, and Shawlette by Joyce Fassbender, who we are great friends with as a designer. We love working with her. And one of the things I want to point out before we get started is that what we're talking about, these are pretty common pattern elements across all patterns, I would say, but the way that we lay it out is a little bit different than other companies do or other books do. So you'll see things that look familiar, or you can use a lot of this information and take it and look at almost any pattern out there. And it's also really good to know what pieces might be missing from a pattern. So if we're going through something that you're seeing here, you're like, oh, I don't think I've ever seen that before. It's something to think about when you're looking at patterns and trying to get that information.
Yeah. Yeah, and not all patterns will have all elements. Like, for example, charts or schematics. Some patterns might have them. Some might have multiple of them. Some might not have any. Just varies by construction and the garment item and everything else. Yeah.
Yeah. And also, we try to make our patterns stand alone as well. So if it's a single pattern that you've purchased, it will have things like a glossary that's pretty comprehensive and includes things that maybe aren't in that pattern but apply to other things. We try to make it as thorough and encapsulated as possible, so you've got all the information you need to make that pattern at your hands when you buy one.
Yeah, and if you buy a whole book, like a physical book or ebook, there'll usually be the glossary at the end that you can refer to throughout the book. And then if you buy one of those patterns from within the book as an individual pattern, then you'll get the info you need with that. Yeah.
Right. So I'm going to switch over and share my screen. And again, if you guys have any questions as we go, please ask. We would love to answer them. Otherwise, we will just do all of the lovely highlights in here. Let's try that. Ta-da! Okay, so this is the Prospects, Cowl, and Shawlette from Joyce Fassbender. And there are, Lee, where would you like to start?
So each of our patterns is going to start with this info page. It's going to have the pattern name, the designer name, copyright info, and then this list of measurements, yarn, needles, notion, gauge. And that's kind of like what you need before you start knitting, like what you need to know to pick out your yarn, pick out your needles, get ready to cast on. And so finished measurements in this case is just, since it's an accessory, it's just one set of measurements for the Cowl version and one set for the Shawlette version. So it has two different options, two different sets of measurements. Now, if you're looking at like a garment with multiple sizes, normally with our patterns, the way we do it is we'll do like the bust circumference as to list the sizes out, and it'll be a series of numbers. So it'll usually be one number and then a bunch of other numbers within parentheses, and that corresponds to like the smallest size through the largest size. So you're going to use that list of measurements to figure out which size you are. And what I like to do, I usually do this digitally, but you can also do it printed out. I like to highlight the size that I'm making and then count, it's the second or third size over from the parenthesis, and then you'll know that that's the size that you want to highlight throughout the entire pattern. like when it says, cast on however many stitches you find, the third one over from the parenthesis, and that's the size that you're casting on. So this finished measurements is where you're going to kind of figure out your size. And then with garments that are complicated and have a lot of different measurements, there'll be a schematic that'll have all the other measurements besides the bust circumference. So the finished measurements on this page is kind of like a reference point to see like what size am I making. But then the schematic is going to be like more detailed measurements. That'll be on a different page.
Right, and you can see some of if it's an asymmetrical piece, so this will give some basic measurements, but the schematic will definitely show you the shape of it and where they're measuring, where the designer is measuring those elements from. Like for this one, it's pretty detailed because this is so the interesting thing about this is it is one version is a cowl. So this is connected, but it's a kind of handkerchief sized cowl, so it's got a pretty deep V, and so that's why you're getting a different measurement. So it's 7 inches at the back and 15 at the front. So she's giving you quite a bit of information here to work with.
Yeah.
And then we talk about
normally most
wingspan.
cowls are just going to have. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Most cowls are just going to have like a circumference and a height because they're not going to be different on the front and back. And this one is explaining the construction a little bit more.
Right. And then for the Shawlette, when we talk about wingspan, which is it's a kind of a funny term, it's talking about the full spread of the shawl. So basically from tip to tip on the longest side. Yeah, exactly. So I always think of when we do the modeled shots, it's like a bird wingspan. So
yeah, like if you hold it out like this, it's your wingspan, the shawl's wingspan.
Yeah.
It's basically the width. But if we said width, you might be like, wait, is it width measured this way? Like, how are you holding it? Right. Yeah.
Right. So then about the yarn.
Sorry.
No, you're good. For the yarn, there's been a lot of conversations, I think, in the knitting community about yarn and yarn substitution. And in our patterns, we recommend, we list out the yarn that it was actually knit in. But then on the website, if you go to this pattern, you can see in our kit builder, if you're on desktop, I think on mobile it doesn't show, but if you're on desktop, there's a kit builder at the bottom that will recommend several other yarns that are pretty good substitutions for it. So in this case, because it's Muse, you might get 3 other worsted weight yarns that we felt like would substitute in. So maybe Swish would be a comparable swap in. So that's a really handy tool that you won't find in the pattern, but you will find on the website. And this is a good starting point for your information for yarn stuff. Yeah, and then it will also I keep trying to highlight something. It will also give you the yarn information. So it includes the weight of the yarn, the name, the fiber content, the yards in grams, so you know how big our skeins are, and you can use that to base your substitutions on if you wanted to swap in another yarn. I always look at the grams and then the yards, and then that's a pretty good way of figuring out how much yarn from another company it might take, or another version of our yarns. And then it gives you the colorway with the number, so you can search for it, and then the number of hanks that it takes to make. In this case, 2 hanks will make both projects, or like you can make 2 hanks will make the cowl and 2 hanks will make the Shawlette. Sometimes you will see, again, that parentheses, so it's 2 hanks or 1 hank, depending upon the size of the project, especially with sweaters and things where the sizing dramatically takes more yarn.
Yeah. So it's that same thing with the sizing where you're going to want to find which is your size, and because it might be, 10, 11, 12, 13, like for a sweater, all different sizes.
Right.
Yeah.
And then for
needles. That's about it for yarn. Yeah.
Yeah. Why don't you talk about needles, Lee?
So for needles, there might just be one kind of needle for this. It looks like there's one kind for the cowl or one kind for the Shawlette. But with some things like with sweaters, you might need, a different size for the ribbing or the neckline, like a smaller needle size for the neckband. Or like for a hat, for the brim, you might need a smaller size. And you also might need like, a long circular for part of it and a short circular for part of it. So there will often be, or DPNs, multiple sizes, or there might be, it might say, long circular for magic loop, or 2 circulars for the 2 circular method, or DPNs, or 16-inch circular. So it's basically choose what style of knitting you like best. So choose how you like to knit in the round. and it'll always say the size, like for here it says US 9 or 5.5 millimeter, or the size needed to obtain gauge. So if you tend to be a loose knitter or a tight knitter, you might not necessarily use the same size that we're recommending. You're going to want to look at that gauge, which is the last item on this page, and use the size needle that you need to get that gauge, because the gauge is the important part.
And the other tip here is that, so Joyce has called out that you need a 16-inch circular needle for the cowl, so you know that you can get away with a shorter needle and a shorter circumference there. But for the Shawlette, you can use basically any length circular needles for working flat. So she's telling you you're working flat or you're working in the round. And again, always it's size to get your own gauge for sure. Yeah.
So then notions are, it's basically always going to say yarn needle, because you need that to weave in your ends at least, if and maybe seaming also. Stitch markers are very common. You might need cable needle, you might need stitch holder, you might need buttons. It's going to tell you basically everything you need besides your yarn and your needles there. And then the gauge, which again, very important. I personally, I would say with something like this, with the shawl, I wouldn't do a gauge swatch for that, but you would want to be aware that if your gauge is off significantly, you might need more yarn, so you want to be careful. But with something like this, I would just start knitting and then kind of like measure my gauge on the knitted item to kind of make sure it's about right. Because if it's off by size, if it doesn't matter, because it's a shawl, right? So you want to think about your item, what you're making. If it's a garment, fit does matter. So if it's a sweater, definitely do a gauge swatch, because you don't want to knit an entire sweater and then have it be size wrong. This is a whole other podcast. I mean, a whole other subject for another Facebook Live for another time. But basically, the gauge is telling you the gauge over 4 inches in whatever stitch pattern. So in this case, it's measured in stockinette stitch, but it might be, you know, in garter stitch or rib or whatever.
Or in pattern, you see pretty often.
Yeah, and it'll usually say either flat or in the round, because your gauge might be different, flat versus in the round. You want to do your gauge swatch, right? Whatever it says, yeah.
Okay. Are we ready to move on, you think?
I think so, yeah. That's the info page. Now we're ready to start knitting.
And if anyone has any questions, let us know as we go. We would love to take questions. We did have a question about posting last week's episode, and it is on the our Facebook page with all of our other lives already, and it's coming to YouTube and our website. It just takes a little while for us to process it through and move it on up through onto our site. So it's coming, but if you want to see it now, you can find it on our Facebook page as well. So for the next page, you'll get things like notes.
Yeah, so all of our patterns always start with a note section. And for all of our patterns, this is something that can be very different from pattern to pattern. We always have kind of an intro paragraph that tells you maybe the inspiration behind the item, or the inspiration behind the name sometimes, or just like, what is the item and what makes it cool and special, and why do you want to make it? And then the second paragraph will usually get a little bit more technical and talk more about like construction, you know, if it's knit in pieces and seamed, or all in one piece, modular, or you know, stitch pattern, like, oh, it's an easy knit purl stitch pattern, or it uses cables or whatever. It'll just get a little bit more like knitty information in that second paragraph. And then after those two paragraphs, it'll get into more important pattern notes. So for example, the charts are worked flat is one note. You'll always see, if a pattern has charts, it'll always say if they're worked flat or in the round, what that means. You know, read it from right to left. And then in this case, there's some other chart notes. There's some stitch marker notes, how to use your stitch markers. So these are all things that are very specific to the pattern. So you definitely want to read those notes. There might be like weird specific things that you wouldn't know just by reading the directions, where you need to read those notes to know. And then we're going to get into special stitches, techniques, stitch patterns. So in this case, we have the knit two together bind off instructions for a special bind off that is not included in the glossary. So we'll get to the glossary last, but basically the glossary has a lot of like really basic stitch patterns, stitch instructions, cast-ons, bind-offs, like grafting and short rows, and lots of stuff that occurs commonly in patterns. But if anything is used in a pattern that's not in the glossary, it's going to go in the notes. That's where we're going to put it. So if there's like an all over repeating stitch pattern, or even sometimes a full chart will be written out, and it might be long, you know, the notes might be an entire page because a whole big long stitch pattern is written out, and that will be included in the notes section. Or just like a special increase that isn't in the glossary, like a lifted increase would be in the notes section.
Right. And I always recommend that you absolutely read the notes section, because it's giving you kind of the roadmap for the pattern. It's giving you things that you might need to look out for. So if you're not sure what this is, now you know it's coming and that you need to be aware of it and not be surprised. Yeah, I mean, you need to research this on later, like on a video, to make sure that you know what it is before you get to it, for sure.
Yeah, you don't need to like memorize everything in the notes section, but you want to read through it first to know what's coming, know what you're getting into, know what to refer back to as you need it. And if you run into anything in the directions that you're like, wait, that wasn't in the notes, then you know to like flip to the glossary and look for it there. Yeah.
Or and then next, I always look at the schematic too, because that's your other big piece of information on. Sometimes it will tell you, like in this case, how it's started or knitted. So for me, I think reading through this, it wouldn't have been clear that you start in the center front and you work your way out like this. That's a really interesting construction. And knowing that ahead of time will help you orient yourself when you're reading through the instructions. You're like, okay, I know where I'm at, and I know how I'm working out, or how I'm increasing or decreasing fabric.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And in this case, because it's just a shawl, we don't have like a measurement schematic like garments will have. It's just the construction schematic for that exact reason, because like, oh, this is an unusual construction. We want to show you visually how it works so you can wrap your head around it. But like with a garment, it'll usually be, it'll be one of two ways with a garment. It'll either be a drawing of the finished garment, and it'll point to a whole bunch of different, top of arm circumference, cuff circumference, length below the armpits to the bottom, length from the yoke, from the top to the armpit, all the different measurements. And it'll be, for our patterns, at least that I do, it'll be to scale. So the sweater will look like the scale of the finished sweater, to be a really technical drawing. Or if the sweater's knit in pieces and then seamed, sometimes the schematic is still showing you the finished sweater, or sometimes it's showing you the different pieces. So it'll be an arm, sleeve piece, and a body piece, and it'll show all the different measurements, because you're going to knit them all separately, block them separately, and then seam them together. So it'll show you less of like, this is the finished thing that you're making, and more of like, this is what you're knitting. This is what your knitted pieces are going to look like. Those are kind of the different types of schematics you might see.
And we have some questions that have come through. Kay is asking, for writing patterns, is there a program that a knitter can use that isn't like a graphic design focused pattern, or a high powered maybe program? She's got a friend asking for a sock pattern that she's written, but she'd like to make it a little bit more, I guess, formal, and a little bit less note like, and more like a real pattern. What do you think, Lee? I think maybe Word.
Program to use.
You can probably use Word just fine.
Yeah, as far as I know, there's not a program that'll like write the pattern for you. You just want to write it in any word processing application that you're used to using. And so Google example, Docs also.
Yeah, absolutely. And for example, this is just text that we have put in and chosen a font for. So there's lots of fonts out there that come standard with your basic word processing unit, and we're just changing colors. All of this is hand done, so it's just typed out. It's not like there's something that generates this. It's Lee's job is to make this beautiful, right?
Yeah.
And for things like this first pattern, and it's just an image. You don't have to make it full like this. It's just a title with the information. It doesn't have to be laid out like this. It could just be one column instead. And with the schematics, that is, you could scan in or do a photo where you're drawing on it, or you could just describe it. And I mean, schematics are important, but there are ways of getting around it. You could also draw it in a few different programs. It just comes down on the computer. So
and a lot of accessories really don't need schematics. Like we generally don't do schematics for socks, hats, basic cowls, scarves, anything that's just like a rectangle, or like a hat is like, if it's a normal hat shape, you know what a hat looks like. We generally skip them for those. Yeah.
And you could also, socks specifically, which is what you were asking for, Kay, is a lot of sock books will come with a chart in them. So it's by size and then the number of stitches you cast on. So there's a lot of really good examples for not doing a whole drawn out schematic, but doing a chart that you could just do in Excel and insert for different sizes and how they lay out into different measurements for each part of the sock for sizing. But if you're just doing a one size sock, there's only a couple of parts you need measurements for, and you can just type that out. It's pretty easy. Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's a great idea, is converting your notes into a more formal pattern that you could share with somebody. That's always, I think that's how a lot of people get started designing too.
Yeah, and there are a lot of professional indie designers who sell their patterns, and they're good patterns to just use Word or something, who aren't graphic designers. And patterns can be very simple as long as the content is good. It doesn't have to be professionally graphic designed. Yeah,
absolutely. So then the next part that we will talk about is a general directions, and this is how we've laid it out. I mean, I've seen a lot of patterns laid out a little differently, but for us, the directions are how to actually knit the project. And so it will be broken out into either the different kinds of projects that you've got. So you've got the cowl versus the shawlette here, and then the finishing, or the different sections. So for a sweater, it might be left arm, right arm, body, or front and back. So you'll see those bigger sections here, and I usually highlight those to make sure I haven't missed anything and know what order that they're having me knit things in.
And you can kind of tell the construction, like with a hat, for example, it would probably usually say brim, body, crown, but maybe it's knit top down and it starts with crown and then body, and you're like, oh, that's interesting. Different than what I expected. So yeah, we try to be like descriptive in our like we generally don't say like section 1, section 2, section 3, unless it's like a scarf that's a rectangle and it's only like the stitch patterns vary. We try to be descriptive so you know what you're knitting as you cast on. And then so the directions are gonna that's going to be when you actually cast on. So our directions are pretty much always going to start with cast on, because that's when you're actually picking up the needles and the yarn and you're going. And then it might refer to the notes, like there might be a stitch pattern where it says, cast on 40 stitches, work seed stitch for 2 inches, and then seed stitch will be up there in the notes, and you'll refer to that.
So for this, the instructions are pretty short because Joyce is pointing you towards the charts that are on the next page. So we can go see that, but you'll get an idea of the setup rows, which is basically the first 1 or 2, sometimes the first 5 rows that are a little bit different than what you're doing repeatedly over and over again. So we usually call those out separately as the setup rows, and then move on to the different sections. So I think we will go on to the charts, and I will flip this. There we go. So now we can see it. So this is what a basic charting, or it looks a little bit complicated, but this is a pretty basic lace chart where you've got your legend. So it tells you, these are the definitions of what all these little symbols mean. And then the repeat, which is this red box here, will tell you when you're starting a row, you'll knit the first 4 stitches, and then you're working this part more than once typically. And then you're working that last stitch or whatever is happening outside the box at the end to finish the row.
Usually the written directions on the other page are going to tell you a bit more details of how many times to repeat that repeat, when to start the chart, how many times to, you might repeat a chart, it might say to knit an entire chart 10 times through, so you're repeating the whole chart over and over. That'll all be in the written directions.
Yeah, and then so you'll see this chart 1 and chart 2, and Joyce has called out when you're working this portion versus this portion, and when you're the basics of just charts is if it's a white stitch or filled in, that means you're knitting it, you're doing something with it in that row, and if it's a dark stitch or black boxes or gray, those are stitches that don't exist until you get to them or create them later in the pattern. So they're just placeholders to keep the chart square.
So you basically pretend those don't exist, ignore them. They're not there. They're not stitches.
Right.
It's a
So
little
again,
bit
the
hard to wrap your
instructions,
head around the first time you use a chart. But
totally.
it makes sense when it's on your needles.
Yeah. And again, the instructions on how to knit a chart are usually on a different part of the pattern. So I tend to print these out and then I unstaple them and lay them next to each other so I can see the chart at the same time I'm reading the instructions. It's a nice tip too. And then, so we've got more charts. So these are also chart 3 or chart 4. She's called out whether it's the Shawlette or another piece. And those instructions will show up in the body of the instructions. And then we have, I'm sorry, I'm going to rotate it. There we go. Usually more additional photos, and these are, while lovely, they're also useful. So you can see how something is laid out, the general shape of something, maybe more views, a close-up of the texture so you can see how that stitch pattern is actually formed using the lace chart, or how the yarn is working out, right? And also how it's worn and how it's fitting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then we have our glossary.
So our older patterns don't have this, but our newer patterns from the last year and a half or so, all are going to have this glossary at the end. It's usually 2 pages, and it has the abbreviations, very important. So if you run into any abbreviation you don't know that's not mentioned in the notes, it's going to be here on this abbreviations list. And that's just all the basic stitches that are common in our patterns. And they might be different from other patterns from other companies or other designers. Abbreviations are not 100% standardized. There's a lot, you know, like knit 2 together and SSK. There's a lot of them that are very standard, but there might be some that vary a little bit from company to company. So if you're not sure about something, definitely check here. And then above we have some like super basic stitches like stockinette and garter stitch. If we just say, you know, knit garter stitch for however many inches, you can always refer to that, and ribbing. And then we have a bunch of different techniques that you might need to use, cast-ons and bind-offs. And then the next page has a bit more other, so there's like short rows and Kitchener stitch and some things that are common in knitting patterns. So most of these are not going to happen in every pattern, but if you're knitting some other pattern that doesn't have a glossary that asks you to use Kitchener stitch, you can open up a Knit Picks pattern and look at the glossary and get your Kitchener stitch instructions there. So
yeah,
good
and
general info. Yeah.
So that's a great,
question.
I think that's a really good basic overview of how patterns are laid out, especially the way that we lay out our patterns. And if you've got more questions about just general, what? Did you notice something?
Can I call out a bunch of people who are watching from all over? Okay, because of the screen sharing, I'm not following comments as much as I usually do, but it looks like we have people from Lancaster, Ohio, Phoenix, Yakima, Washington, Hamilton, Ontario, North Dakota, Colorado, Rochester, New York, Edmonton, Canada, and Oregon, where we are. Thank you, everybody, for watching.
Joining us today.
And that's probably not even a complete list, so thank you from wherever you are. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah. So if you've got any other questions about patterns, we would love to answer them in the comments after this is done. Being live, we check back in every once in a while. You can also find some great examples of different kinds of pattern layouts or instructions you might find in patterns through all of our free patterns. So feel free to browse through the huge collection of free patterns that we have on the site and just get familiar with the different techniques and different constructions that you might find. And in the meantime, if you are looking for extra content between broadcasts, because we will be taking August off. So Lee and I will see you back here in September. We're going to take a quick break for a month and come back with some really great content for you in August, September. And
in the comment, we just got a comment that Rebecca says she's afraid of charts. And I just want to say, don't be afraid of charts. They're not scary. They might look scary, especially the ones we just showed you are pretty complicated. Actually, there's much simpler charts out there. So I would really recommend doing a pattern that has both the chart and the written directions also. So that way you can use the chart, but you can check the written directions just to like make sure you're getting it right. to build your confidence, because I think shirts are really great, and you can, once you get the hang of them, they're, I mean, everyone's brains work differently. So just because they're easy for me doesn't mean they're easy for everyone. And I understand that. But I think once you wrap your head around it, it can make knitting really fun because you get like a visual of what you're going to be knitting on the page. Yeah.
And something that helps me with charts is I tend to keep the rows that I've worked open, but then I cover up all the future rows so I can only see up until where I've worked. So I can kind of see how the stitches have interacted with each other. I get a sense of the pattern, but then I'm only focusing on that row that I'm actually working on right now. So I'm not getting overwhelmed with what's happening or accidentally jumping to another row too early. And that's helped a little bit, trying to keep it more manageable or less overwhelming.
We forgot to call out at the beginning to watch to the end because we were going to show you a sneak peek at the end, and we didn't mention it. But can we show you a sneak peek of what's to come in a couple weeks? Yeah, because we're not going to be here in a couple weeks on Facebook Live, but we're going to be releasing this book in a couple weeks. It's a book of modular blankets, which I'm really excited about because they're all so cool and colorful, and I did these really fun color it yourself diagrams for all of them. You can see what they all look like and get to a good example. So you can see the diagrams of what they look like and the colors they were knit in, and then you can color in your own to try out different colors for every one. I love this one. This might be my favorite. Rainbow. I love anything rainbow. Different sizes. And then, yeah, we just wanted to share that with you. Something to look forward to in a couple weeks.
I can tell the mailman is here. So that's I always know that dogs get very excited at 9 o'clock. So we will definitely see you back here in September. And in the meantime, if you're looking for extra goodies, then check out our website. We have the Learning Center, which is full of freebies to keep you busy. Lee has done some amazing coloring sheets on there that are like just knitter cool and less diagram specific, but you've been on a coloring sheet jag for a little while, and I love them. And you can catch us on Instagram and also our Together We Knit group on Facebook. There's a bunch of knitters in there having fun. And I saw somebody commented that they've missed knitting with people and they want that community back. That's a great group to join. So if you can and want to, the Together We Knit group is such a great welcoming community of crafters. And if you're a crocheter, you're welcome there too. I love seeing everyone's projects. And yeah, we will see you back here in September. So have a good break, everybody. Keep that knitting going.
Yeah. Right. Happy summer.
Thank you, Lee. Bye everybody.
Bye, Hannah.